Welcome to the Weekly Dive. I'm your host, Nate, and this is my show where I dive into things that I find interesting, usually related to the music that I or people I know are working on. In this week's case, I'm going to be going into my song Voyage that I just put out on Wednesday. Um, in addition to these videos being put out every Friday, I do have a song that comes out every Wednesday. Most of them will kind of be paired together. That won't always be the case. Um, I really wanted to try to push the envelope in the way that musicians are putting out music. I think, we all see all of the big promotion for things, but I think, for me as a musician, I feel a lot more natural in this space of I work on something, I get it done, I think it's cool, I put it out, and I let it exist in the world that it's in. And I think we oftentimes as musicians focus a lot on the innovation of sound design and stuff like that, but there isn't a lot of focus on the way things are being done in the interaction between the musician and the audience, the listeners. And so I like that idea that it's very accessible as well. I want anybody to be able to listen and check things out if they want to. I also wanted to create these videos because I wanted to show people sort of see into my process and maybe see where my headspace goes when I make some of the decisions that I make. And I also think having a community and having resources like this is really helpful and really beneficial, and I'll get to that a little bit at the end of the video. But without further ado, let me hand it off to producer Nate to run through the song.
Well, thank you, Broadcast Nate. Again, like he said, I'm producer Nate, and I'm going to be taking you through my new track, Voyage. So as we dive in, I'm going to be talking to you guys about how I kind of layered and structured out the main drop of the song. So the kind of big room house one, this one if you haven't heard it yet. Yeah, you get the idea. However, I know some of you haven't heard it, but the second drop is also cool. But we're going to go over the first one. So check it out if you haven't heard the second one. It's worth the listen. So here, the things I kind of wish I would have learned when I was kind of working on stuff is kind of understanding the macro of the track, the arrangement, looking at this kind of thing more from a whole to kind of make sure all of the parts are in there. I would always wonder, like, well, are all the pieces in the puzzle, like are they there? And I feel pretty confident with how I've kind of sat with some of these ones, and especially in this song. So I wanted to share with you guys some of those, and kind of just walk through my thought process for them. I didn't really want to dive deep into like sound design or things like that, because there are great videos on that. But here's sort of my understanding of how I kind of put these things together, and how I'm able to make them sound the way they am with some kind of more specific tools. So first, and kind of as a little bit of a mixing instruction, I like to start with my drums. My theory and idea for these kind of songs is that I really want the drums centered. I want them to feel really good in the middle, especially the kick and any type of snare or clap sound. Hi-hats and things I will kind of spread if I can, in the kind of the panning stereo field, but I will add reverb to kind of add some space to the snare. So here's those sounds. Oops, that's the wrong part. So it just sits, it's really tight, it's really crisp. I think that's important because a lot of the other sounds are going to have a lot more of it is like held out or sustained. So the next part I go to is usually the bass, and here's them together. So I try to make sure with this part that the bass and the kick are occupying the same space, as far as like when the kick comes in versus when the bass comes in. It's not like more bass is coming in when one's coming in, one just making space for the other, which is usually done with sidechain. So that's what I did here. But as far as leveling wise, try to make sure that works well. I've recently been compressing bass and kicks and sort of the drum sounds together a bit. I saw Michael Brower do that, and it's been a great tool. So it kind of helps keep everything level as far as those low end kind of sounds go, which I know when I was learning. I was like, man, the why is the bass so much heavier when it hits this lower note, or why is it way hotter when it hits this high note? That's a good way to kind of work on that, as well as some general EQ. In some cases, I would recommend taking out the some high end, but I really liked some of the tone of this bass, so I kept it in. But yeah, so that's one thing I would do. I didn't do that here. Oh, the reason it's also grayed out or white, I froze a bunch of these tracks to try to save up some CPU when doing some of this screen recording. You kind of see your meter up here if you're working in Ableton, but what it allows it to do is free up some CPU because it's now not running any of these things. It basically took a screen capture of the track and is holding it there in a state between audio file and the original MIDI that you see. So you can unfreeze it at any point and do that, or flatten it and turn it into just audio. If you know you're done with something, but you think there's maybe a chance you want to go back and edit the MIDI later, and you don't want to commit it to audio yet, this is a good way to kind of have an in between. And Ableton did a really, really good job with it. I know some other programs do it as well, but I really like the way they made it look and function here. So then what I did was actually went to the lead sound, because I really think in my mind, like, I have the main functionality of the drum and the bass. That's one thing I want people to be focusing on. The most recent person I believe I heard, it was Greg Wells, was saying that listeners can really only focus on two things at once. And so the main things I want them to be focusing on is the lead sound, which is the melody, which is this, and the drums. I'm leaving the bass in there just because the bass also adds, but we'll have those together. This is what I want people to be focused on. Everything around it now, because that's the main idea of the song. Everything around it is just adding parts to it. The bass is important because this is what's creating a lot of the movement and the drive and the fun. The part of the music you feel. Now, one thing I did with these synths that I think I really do want to share, that I think is important, is that I added a return channel, which you do right click over in this area or anywhere and you insert return track. What this does is it creates one of these and allows you to send audio to them. You can do a lot of other crazy automation, things like that, but for this case, we can send audio to it and it can act now like a new channel that's adding sound from a previous channel to the whole mix. So in this case, what I did was I added the lead and sent it to this spread, and I added a compressor to kind of squash it a bit, to kind of alter the sound a bit. This one gives a nice little grittiness, but you could do a similar thing with a glue compressor in Ableton. Then what I did was I came down here and I moved the utility width a bit, which is really nice. One thing I like to do now in my drops is I show the automation with you right click and press A. And I now open it up as the build happens and then sustain it during the drop, and then I bring it down during verse sections or things like that. What this does is it makes it so that as the drop hits, it's like, oh, now there's a bunch more information coming from the stereo sides, so it can be a bit more exciting. But I'm not doing it in the main channel because the main channel is still providing a lot of the good signal in between, which is creating sort of the good mono channel of signal. So now that we have that, and this is kind of existing in sort of a middle to upper mid range, with just that, this is what we have. This is cool. And this is where oftentimes I really was most of the time. I was like, cool, there's a lead, there's a bass, there's a drums. You know, maybe I'd have like a keyboard or a thing in there. I didn't really understand the process that kind of came in with what leads were, what basses were, what synths were, what supported what, where things went. So for basses, it's pretty obvious. Just kind of any bass line of any way that you consider a bass line, I think is important there. Drums, obviously personal choice. I've really been a fan of using a lot of like hip hop sounding drums in house songs now. I think they kind of just add a nice new texture. For the leads, again, mainly focus on sounds, in my opinion, that are more mid-range to upper mid-range, because those are kind of that shinier, more exciting texture and sound. But obviously, if you're getting into bass music, that changes the whole spectrum. The chords now and kind of the synths, in my mind, are kind of the thing that are creating the room. They're creating the environment for everything else, all these important things to exist in. Now, don't get me wrong for what I'm saying. Like, oh, you said, people only focus on two things. That's true, but you focus on the things that are already in the room you're in. So you have to be somewhere to experience something. It's like the universe in a way. It's like, how do you know if something happens or doesn't happen? We're not going to get into that, but you can extrapolate a little bit. These really create a nice support for everything else. Kind of tells everything, oh hey, we're in this key or whatever too. But one of the things that I also didn't really learn early on was how to make room for the other sounds that you're doing. Now, these synths take up a lot of space. There's like four, I think there's four, yeah, only four, but there's a lot going on. So the first thing I did was, this is just an automation from, opening it up in a build and things like that for a filter. I think my other video covered that a bit, but I'm happy to explain it later if you would like as well. But it was the EQ8, and I started to create room for the lead sound to exist in as well as the bass. So I took out this low end. I did that as well in the lead sound so that you can create space for the bass to exist on its own, so it's a lot more pure and clean tone. But what I did that I think a lot of people don't do a whole lot is mid-side EQing. And I feel like it's such a technical, hokey, smoky term, but it should be the way you EQ every single time. I don't know why you wouldn't do this every time as much as you can. I really only started doing it on this track, and ever since then I've used it on everything else I've done. I mean, I've used it before, like I learned it in classes and stuff, but I was like, oh, this is fine, but regular EQ works. This does such a great job. One thing that's important with this is this does come with some time to get your ears used to hearing what it's doing. So please mess around in mid-side and try some stuff out. How to get there, you add an EQ. There's this little mode option here, and you choose the MS option or mid-side. You'll have this little edit option. It'll probably say M first. And you can carve out space like this like you would a normal EQ, or you can press this little button and it does this, and you can look at it even bigger. But what you do, and I hit it with this button, you'll want to hit it down later too. But I knew that the lead sound had some good frequencies here because I was messing around and basically doing this and a bunch of stuff to find out what was nice with the lead there. And then so I took some out here in the mid area because I knew the lead sound was most important there. And if that synth is as big and powerful as it is, and because it's a big synth, it's going to be occupying some of the similar space because the tones are similar. If we don't cut things out, it's just going to be really muddy. And so, however, we have the bass driving underneath. We have the drums driving underneath. We have the lead running on the top. We have these chords kind of running in the middle. There wasn't really anything running on the outside. So I actually ended up boosting on the side the EQ that it's losing in the middle. So you actually still hear that texture on the side, but it adds kind of some new sounds that aren't just in the middle. So if you're listening in headphones or are able to have sort of a stereo experience, it really can enhance that as well. I also originally threw on this auto pan, which if you don't know how to use auto pan like this, I will give you a quick rundown. But basically, don't forget to hit this arrow. You can have it like pan back and forth, or you can have it pan like the volume like up and down, which is cool. So here's this sound. And I do use that at the end of the song, like the full open sound. I really like it, but in this part, I wanted the lead to be the focus, so this needed to be cleaner. And what I did was, you can hear how much reverb and stuff happens. So the thought here was, oh, well, if I look at this and this is the volume, it's like taking out the volume after each thing, which makes it more clean. But it also made it way more bouncy. And so I said, okay, that's fine. We'll keep it like that and then mess with it later. For synths, I would say I recommend kind of just playing around with things that work together. Similar sounds are really important, and almost think about it like a stem. Like of course you can combine random stuff and throw it in there and it works. But the way I like to look at it, at least to start, is like I want to find one sound that I really like, and the next sound is kind of like it, and then I keep kind of adding stuff that that kind of keeps it's a little bit, but it's still a little different, so that each sound is having different textures. If you're having the same sound, at least add some other effects or things like that, so you're not having the same exact sound, because if they're the same sound, they're happening together at the same time, it's just going to sound muddy and bad, and you probably will get phase cancellation, which is just kind of the sound reflecting in itself. It's a weird kind of thing to explain, but there are other really great videos on it if you are interested in what phase cancellation is, but not the case here if you just don't use the exact same sound in the exact same space. So again, when I was really learning, I didn't really get the idea, the macro play of a song, and not just like arrangement, but macro in my sense of like just getting the whole picture of like, okay, like this is, I'm working on a drop part right now, or I'm working on this, so it needs to get bigger, it needs to explode, right? You can see these synths aren't happening in the verse part, and there's less of them happening before the drop. It's important to make sure things are adding or coming into play. For the layering aspect, really you got to make sure there's low end and drums. Like for house tunes or any of these things, like that's a pretty important part. There are a lot of great tunes where it's just the bass and the drums, and that's awesome. When you're kind of getting into this space, synths really create that sort of foundation of the room again. Just make sure that's kind of the space that they exist in, unless the chords are the focus. If the chords become the focus, which I think is a lot of case in like Don Diablo songs where they're really bouncy and fun, then make them the focus, and then you wouldn't do these dips and EQs. You'd probably do these kind of dips and maybe some of the other sounds, or maybe some of the layers more specifically, so that they have room for some of the other layers in that case. But this was my dive into Voyage, and I will say in a second, or Broadcast Me will say in a second, but please feel free to reach out if you want any other help or further explanations, or if you want me to help set up things. If you're like what am I missing? Like, I feel like this sounds good, but you did something that I feel like I wasn't able to do, but I can't figure out what it was. Shoot me a message, add a comment. I'm happy to help. But with that, I'll hand it back to Broadcast Nate.
Thanks, producer Nate. Well, I hope you guys saw something or learned something that you might be able to use in one of your projects, or maybe something new you can use in a new project. I want these resources to be available to you outside of YouTube as well, so please feel free to shoot me a message or leave a comment if you want something to be explained further. Probably more quickly to answer something through Instagram, but I'll do the best I can anywhere you need me to. Once I get to about 100 subscribers or so, I plan to add project files. So like and subscribe and share the video and the song too if you guys liked it. And with that, my name was Nate, and this has been The Weekly Dive.